All right, well, thank you for joining me today. My name is Hannah Heimbuck. I am a commercial fisherman from Alaska and also a fisheries consultant with Ocean Strategies, and I'm here talking to Michael Rubino from NOAA Fisheries. Thank you and welcome. Glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Michael, we haven't met before. I wanted to introduce myself just a little bit. I live and fish out of the Gulf of Alaska here in the North Pacific. I also work for the public affairs firm Ocean Strategies, and we work with fisheries and seafood folks around the country, topics like markets, sustainability, how policy affects fishing communities, and how we can all build a stronger seafood system. So that's some of what we're going to talk about today, NOAA's new National Seafood Strategy. But before we go on, I'd love to have you just introduce yourself, your role, and kind of what you do with NOAA Fisheries.
Yeah, well, thanks. My name's Michael Rubino. I'm the Senior Advisor for Seafood Strategy. So I'm one of the 4 senior scientists in the agency, part of the management team, and we're sort of like the brain trust for the agency. We advise the agency on stock assessments, ecosystem-based fishery management systems, economics, and I do markets. So the whole value chain of seafood markets in terms of the agency's work on that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, we are going to get into some policy details, but we do like to start with a light question because we can all connect, I think, around eating seafood. So I wondered, what is your favorite go-to seafood, whether that's when you're out at a restaurant or buying something to cook at home? What do you like?
I would provide 2. One, especially when I'm on the West Coast, I love black cod or sablefish. I mean, prepared, baked or poached instead of a miso or Pan Asian spice flavoring. Soup is really terrific. One of the side benefits of my job as I travel and visit docks and farms and so on and processors around the country is to sample oysters on the half shell. It's really a way to taste, sort of very viscerally the local environment, salt, sweet, metallic, melon, buttery. You get a real sense for the local environment that way.
That's amazing. That's so true.
I started out early in my seafood career farming shrimp and crayfish in South Carolina. And I think if I was to start over today, I'd probably be growing oysters.
Yeah, that looks like a pretty nice way to make a living on the water. And that's very true that coast to coast, region to region, the tastes are so different. And it's amazing how the different ecosystems can create that. For me, my tastes have not changed since I was 8 years old, probably. I love fried clams. And I think probably a little biased because I had to dig them myself, but then it was very rewarding once you get to that, you get to the lunchtime. So got to stick with the classics. Well, thanks. Well, great. Appreciate you sharing a little bit more about yourself. Let's talk a little bit about NOAA policy then, and specifically the National Seafood Strategy. So just for context for other folks, this document is to outline direction for NOAA Fisheries to support a strong domestic U.S. seafood economy, and then also to enhance resilience in the seafood sector, and particularly in the face of climate change and other stressors, and just kind of that ongoing NOAA mandate for management and conservation. And what I wanted to ask you first, Michael, was just a little bit about why this strategy and why now. Kind of seeing that a lot of the language of the strategy recognizes challenge the seafood sector is or might experience, climate issues, food security, balancing the needs and competition of waterfront infrastructure, all of these kind of complex things. And so I wanted to just hear a little bit from you about what makes this timely.
Well, you introduced that quite well for me. I mean, we know, but I think there's also an increasing awareness in policy circles that seafood is critical to enhancing public health and nutrition, creating jobs, building a climate resilient food strategy. I don't know a catchier way of saying that yet. The U.S. fishing industry and federal and state agencies have really worked hard during my time in the industry to end overfishing, to put all of our wild stocks under rebuilding plans. I mean, U.S. fisheries management is the gold standard. This is a success story. But as you pointed out, the benefits provided by this vital industry are threatened by a variety of unprecedented challenges. I think COVID, the pandemic in 2020, was really a wake-up call for all of us. Markets were disrupted, restaurants shut down, Revenues for U.S. seafood producers in 2020 were down anywhere from 10 to 80%, depending upon gear type and species, according to market snapshot surveys that our economists did. I mean, yes, the industry's recovered since, but the recovery's been uneven. Markets, trade, and supply chain disruptions continue, in part because of the fallout of COVID, in part because of inflation and a war in Ukraine. On top of that, as you pointed out, we've got new ocean uses, such as offshore energy, wind energy. We've got labor shortages, aging boats, processing, the graying of the fleet, conversion of working waterfronts. All of those things affect the long-term health of the industry. And perhaps the most important risk, which you also mentioned, is climate change. Rapidly altering food webs, species abundance, habitats. I mean, the current shutdown of Alaska crab is the proverbial canary in the coal mine. So during the past couple of years, across the seafood spectrum, fishermen, seafood farmers, tribes, processors, retailers, they've come to me, to my colleagues at NOAA Fisheries, asking what can we do as an agency to work with them to increase the resilience, profitability, and competitiveness of this U.S. seafood industry. And what can we do better to be prepared for future shocks? So that's the genesis of the seafood strategy that's out for public comment. It's really a product of these conversations and of a series of small industry roundtables that our director, Janet Coit, hosted last year.
Yeah, I really appreciate the regional conversations that folks have been having. Really appreciate Janet Coit coming to Alaska and talking with a huge variety of stakeholders there. I know that's happening in other regions as well. It's interesting talking about the kind of the high level of sustainability that U.S. fisheries hold themselves to. I feel like we're kind of having to redefine that a little bit as we deal with some of the stressors we haven't planned for before, right? COVID-19 and climate impacts that are just really difficult to predict. And so would it be fair to say that part of this is sort of redefining sustainability a little bit, in that laying out how are we going to have to adapt and plan together to be sustainable in sort of the new normal that we're experiencing in some places? Do you see this kind of shifting mindset of sustainability a little bit? Or does it reinforce what NOAA's always kind of done?
Well, I think we need to continue to reinforce the sustainability messages and the wise management that we have both for wild capture and aquaculture. I think in the process of asking leading questions and going around the country and listening, we heard loud and clear from fishermen and processors that the core fisheries work of the agency, so stock assessments, management through the regional fishery management councils, that continues to be fundamental to the agency's mission. But we also heard that this collaborative management of wild capture is not enough to sustain the industry in the face of these challenges. We also heard a desire to increase sustainable production of both wild and farmed, a desire to put more U.S. seafood back on U.S. plates. We heard that the variety of industry services provided by the agency are important. Grants, the fishery finance program, seafood inspection service, as you said, telling the story about sustainability through Fish Watch, economic market social analysis, Sea Grants Young Fishermen's Training Program. In other words, managing fish as a resource is fundamental, but opportunities to expand and highlight work on fish as food and to increase domestic production jobs and market opportunities are also important. So, these activities aren't new to the agency, but what is new is sort of a refocus on industry support in the face of these challenges.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I do appreciate the refocus on food and food systems. I think from local to global levels, the U.S. has a very strong role in those food systems. And as a food provider myself, as a fisherman, I love hearing folks and leaders around the country really recognizing that role of harvesters in the seafood industry providing food. So appreciate that perspective. And all of these things have laid out kind of the landscape that the seafood strategy is operating in. But from kind of an implementation standpoint, where are we headed? I know that NOAA's collecting comments right now for a few weeks longer, but what comes after that? Kind of, can we talk to stakeholders about what to expect from a strategy like this? How does it enter into either management or NOAA operations and implement across the country?
Sure. Perhaps first a bit of context. I mean, this strategy builds on the broader NOAA 2030 vision, and is one of a handful of complementary strategies that are sort of nested under NOAA Fisheries priorities. That includes climate-ready fisheries, an aquaculture strategy, which recently came out, the work of our International Affairs Office on illegal, underreported, unreported fishing, port state measures, and equity and environmental justice strategy, and then the work we do for protected resources and habitat. I mean, one of the reasons why we're seeking public comment is that the objectives of the strategy are ambitious. Let's face it.
Yeah.
We have limited staff, budget, time. Our resources are already stretched. So we're asking for advice on priorities, particularly about the seafood part of our mission. What should we focus resources on during the next 5 years or so? Some things we're already doing, but there may be a few additional cost-effective things we can do with existing resources that will unlock big dividends. And some potential actions really are aspirational. So the strategy implementation will help us to identify emerging priorities and to formulate and really make the case for future budget requests. So yes, all of the feedback from the public comment will be used to prepare a final draft of the strategy and to develop an implementation plan. And for those responding to the strategy, there are a couple of overarching questions we'd love to get feedback on. First, from your perspective, does the strategy capture what's important to you? Second, what else do you want to see? What's missing? And three, do you have recommendations on how we implement any particular goal or element?
Yeah, all really good. You brought up funding. And it sounds like you're seeking like I said, a lot of input on ambitious goals, and I think the right goals. There's great things in the strategy for different folks to focus on, but when it comes to implementation and having the funding to kind of make those a reality, what is that process like? Will this have to fit into NOAA's existing budget, or will there be kind of an effort to raise additional funds? I know that from fishing communities' perspectives, we always see, reinforcing the budget for the great work that you guys already do in stock assessments, and like critical fisheries research is really important. And we want to see that stay strong and possibly increase within climate change and the impacts we're seeing. But also, we don't want to make sure there's resources behind some of these new strategies. So do you see part of this being seeking additional funding beyond what NOAA's budget is currently?
Well, officially, I mean, everything we do is within existing resources and what Congress allocates and appropriates. As I said, there's some things we can do now. The fundamental work of stock assessments and allocations for the council is going to continue. That doesn't change.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, that we need additional resources for that, especially in the face of climate change and new ocean uses like offshore wind energy. But as we work through our internal budget processes for future budgets, as we work with stakeholders and you work as stakeholders with Congress, what are the priorities for potential future budgets? And how do we sort of broaden the stakeholder base for the agency? And the agency's budget's been essentially flat for 10 years or more. So the real dollars go down. How do we make the case? I mean, as I said, starting off, we know that seafood's important for public health and nutrition and jobs and so on, but does everybody else? And how do we make that case? So we need to work together on that. So I think part of this strategy, the aspirational part of this strategy, is to get there. No, we can't do all of this. Some of this is also, how do we leverage other people's money and capabilities, especially on the sort of strengthening the entire seafood sector, goal 4 of the strategy. Working across federal agencies to modernize, to recapitalize. Part of that is, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Economic Development Administration, they have deep pockets and funds that NOAA Fisheries doesn't have. But we can provide advice that doesn't take up a lot of staff time. For example, USDA's buying programs for school lunches and nutrition programs. Our seafood inspection program works behind the scenes to provide the specifications, product form, and then actually inspects the processing plants that provide those meal kits and nutrition packages. Another example from my previous work in the agency on aquaculture is we provided a small amount of funding to Julie Decker at the Alaska Fisheries Development Foundation to work with folks in Alaska and elsewhere on a mariculture strategy and initiative. Well, that's leveraged probably $80 million from other agencies, Economic Development Administration, USDA, private foundations, Sea Grant, and others to develop seaweed farming, kelp farming in Alaska. So those weren't capabilities that we had as an agency, but we were able to use a little bit of our funding and our knowledge base to leverage much greater amounts of funding. So that's at play here too.
Oh yeah, that's a great example. I really appreciate efforts to better connect the entire U.S. food system. Sometimes it can feel like seafood is off on its own, and a lot of the other conversations around food security happen, in other agencies. So I really appreciate the USDA buying program focusing on seafood. That I think is an excellent, really healthy move to include healthy protein in schools and homes across America. And as we talk about how to make those bigger connections and then how to get input from all of the people this is really affecting, I'm thinking now about some of the retailers and distributors that move seafood across the country that have it in outlets. I happen to be able to pull it out of the water myself, but I know a lot of people aren't in that position. And I'm just kind of wondering, I hear that you're hearing from harvesters and processors, people that are really on the waterfront. But are you hearing from the retailers that are really, most Americans' access to seafood?
Some of us do. I do as part of my job, is to visit with folks from the entire spectrum. Our outreach and communications office as well works with the Food Marketing Institute, for example, and many of the big supermarkets. We have working relationships with chefs who are very in tune with the seafood sector, folks like Barton Seaver. And so that's a way to connect with sort of the broader retail community. I think during COVID, there was a lot of innovation that went on as restaurants shut down. Direct marketing, farmers markets. We heard a lot about during COVID of folks wanting to know where their food comes from and to buy local and to be willing to do that. So those are all positive things I think that come out of the retail end.
Yeah, absolutely. I've also, as we talked about this, thought about some of the other policies or strategies that NOAA is working on. You brought up the kind of the larger agency-wide strategy. Also have seen a national fisheries strategy and then an equity and environmental justice strategy, kind of responding to various administrative orders. One of the questions I've gotten from folks is how do these things work together? I definitely am seeing in all of them, some of the more difficult topics that NOAA deals with a massively diverse stakeholder group of fishery dependent communities, people that are small local producers, and then people that, feed a much larger populace. And I was wondering if, balancing those different needs is kind of top of mind as you're thinking about the seafood strategy, and how does it integrate with the EEJ strategy as well?
Yeah, well, that's a very broad question.
It is.
Wild capture, aquaculture, international trade, seafood inspection, those are all things amongst NOAA Fisheries' diverse seafood mandates. All federal agencies have a variety of diverse mandates. So there are always trade-offs in managing natural resources and meeting multiple objectives. I mean, just think about wild capture fisheries. You're managing to maximum sustained or biological yield, or are you maximizing economic yield? Who is allotted quota and catch shares? Who gets to use ocean space? What about jobs and fishing communities? How do we sustain those? So I think the aim of the seafood strategy is to foster opportunities for all the participants in the U.S. seafood sector and to expand markets for seafood. Maybe if I could use a cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats. And as I noted earlier, we as an agency can't do it all. So yes, these various strategies are complementary, but we have limited staff, budget, and time. So we're asking advice on direction and priorities and how to use our resources and talents wisely. And as I mentioned earlier, how to leverage others when they have far more resources or knowledge about how to implement particular things that support our common objectives. On EEJ in particular, I would say there's overlap in terms of subsistence fishing, tribal fishing. You know, in the face of pressures to consolidate, how do we maintain diversity of opportunity for small and medium scale enterprises in the seafood industry? How do we create opportunities for new entrants and young fishermen, which is a real concern at the moment. We've got serious labor issues, particularly in processing labor, which is largely made up of recent immigrants and guest workers. So these are thorny questions that you know, we as an agency are aware of. We don't necessarily have the capabilities to delve into all of it, but we'd like to work with the seafood industry and the range of folks in the industry and with other agencies and with states, tribes, and so on. You know, we will continue to consult with the councils, the commissions, fishing associations, fishermen, seafood farmers, and others on implementing this to wade our way through all of these multiple objectives.
Yeah. Do you see this coming kind of to the councils for input as you get more to the kind of the regional phase of bringing these plans into play?
Yeah, and I would say in the past week, we've already had requests from most of the councils to provide briefings. So we will do that over the next several months. Most of that won't be before the March 16th deadline providing comments, but obviously will be part of, this will be a year-long process in terms of putting together an implementation plan. So I would say that a revised strategy will be out later in the year, and towards the end of the calendar year, we'll have a vetted implementation plan.
That's great. Well, that was kind of my last question there is I know that this comment period is closing, but that there's probably more time throughout the year to hear from all these various stakeholders, either regionally through briefings, but also directly to DC. Is that right? You guys are will be taking engagement from stakeholders throughout the year?
That's right. And at the regional office and science center level around the country, our leadership is well aware of all this. They understand the arguments and the difficulties. So you can reach out to them as well. And we're sort of socializing this throughout all of our staff members too. We've also got, in addition to the councils and commissions, we've got the Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee, which meets periodically, which actually helped discussions with them, helped to formulate this strategy over the past year. So there's been a lot of input already, and you know, this is going to be a living document, a living strategy to adapt as we go. But we wanted to, as I said, to bring back a bit of the seafood industry and industry services aspect of the agency's mission to the fore. We've done a great job on the sustainability and the conservation side, but in the face of these challenges, that may not be enough going forward to sustain both the biological sustainability of it as well as the industry sustainability.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those insights. I know that there's a lot of people that are seafood and fishery dependent across the U.S., but that don't necessarily have a relationship with NOAA or necessarily, you know, a close understanding of how you guys operate. So I really appreciate this opportunity to just kind of shed some light on that and the very complicated job you all have of working with our fisheries. Anything else that we should talk about that we missed?
One thing I thought of is, you know, crises like COVID or even climate change, crises often create opportunities. You know, we need to remember that despite all these threats and systemic problems we've been talking about, large parts of the U.S. wild capture fisheries sector are thriving. We have a small but vibrant growing aquaculture sector, especially oysters, clams, mussels, seaweed. And as I mentioned, during COVID, when restaurants are shut down, sometimes, you know, a crisis means innovation. So we found all kinds of new ways of getting seafood to market. Supermarket sales of seafood in 2020 were actually up during COVID. And I think people thought about where their food comes from during that crisis. And we have a good story to tell as a US seafood industry, as you mentioned. And that's really something to build on going forward.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I think that was a great way to close out our conversation.